as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He was a soldier who had given 45 years of service to his country. 222 years ago this month, he crafted a farewell address to the nation. In it, he made no attempt to recount his time as a businessman, warrior, lawmaker, founder, framer, battlefield commander, or president of a United States that he, more than any other, helped to create. Instead, George Washington chose to offer, quote, disinterested warnings of a parting friend, end quote, which he felt were important for the permanency of our felicity as a people. Leaders today departing public service might recount their personal journey and thank those who shared some of their path. Washington's final words were nothing of the sort. He chose instead to look far into the future and address all of us. The future. None of us can know it. We get occasional glimpses of it by talking to older people, those a little further down the road. From them, we gain wisdom and counsel. Yet sadly, each generation imagines that it faces unprecedented problems only to dismiss the counsels of the generation or two before them. We find it tough to absorb the wisdom of Solomon when he stated, "There is nothing new under the sun." Another way to put it is this: times change, people don't. Taking this truth, what would George Washington say to us if he were here today? What counsels would he give our nation? What relevance would it have? Fortunately, in this gleaming alabaster city that bears his name, we have rich archives to continue to hear from George Washington. Whether we are wise enough to heed Washington is another matter altogether. Surprisingly, he gave no recommendation for us to love liberty, as liberty is in the very fiber of the human race, and was certainly heightened among the early Americans whose efforts had recently secured it. Instead, Washington made a vital observation while trying to give future Americans a heads up. Here it is: liberty does not secure independence. Washington knew a fallen mankind would flourish in liberty, and as such, Americans would be enticed to reduce and erode our independence for temporary gain or perceived future benefit. Instead of liberty, he identified unity as the essential factor to retain American independence. At first ponder, this seems counterintuitive. After all, unified efforts require a certain accommodation to one another for greater good, necessitating an occasional deferential, voluntary reduction in one's personal liberty. Unity achieves result without reducing liberty through power, pen, statute, or sword. For these reasons, Washington told America that unity was, quote, the main pillar in the edifice of your independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize, end quote. Even after 242 years as a republic, we still embody this idea in our national motto, E pluribus unum, a Latin phrase meaning out of many, one. We see it in our pledge with terms like one nation, indivisible. But what of our behavior today? We still on occasion employ the words, but we deploy actions that could better be described as e pluribus pluribus, one hyphenated nation and divisible. Washington warned of it, quote, "It is easy to foresee that from different causes and from quarters much pains will be taken, many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth. that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think of it as your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts, end quote. Washington's words today read like stinging rebuke to all Americans. Instead of guarding our institutions jealously with cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment, we in these august chambers across every aisle allow disruption to displace discourse, polarization to pass for politics, and resistance to replace result. Mr. Speaker, we stand condemned, but not irredeemable. Like any first step, admitting the problem is the path to recovery. How did we allow these congressional chambers to suffer such infiltration? Our own history contains sharp lessons of discord, the loss of our own lawmakers by caning and shooting, sometimes by our own selves, a preference for conflict over constitution, and a division so great that we ended up destroying each other on America's fields and farms from Gettysburg to Vicksburg. Washington's warnings went unheeded a mere 100 years after he gave them. We self-corrected, but only after great harm to ourselves. It has been 150 years since we nearly destroyed each other. Are we on any more secure a path? It would appear from our treatment of each other and our view of our own nation's future that we are tempted to walk an old path. If that be the case, then taking counsel from George Washington might be a timely exercise. With regard to unity, we must realize we are all in the ship of state together. Crashing it on the rocks as we fight each other for control of the helm will deny any safe harbor we wish to obtain. Washington believed that we must view our unity as a sacred tie that links together the various parts. Quote, citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have a common cause, fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. Your union ought to be considered as a main prop to your liberty, and that the love of one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other, end quote. If the unity of our people be the main prop of our liberty, what was it that George Washington believed would knock out that prop? Warning number 1 and number 2 from George Washington: geographical and party disunion. Washington believed, quote, a government for the whole is indispensable, end quote. When various parts of the country come to feel that they are more important than the others, they will, quote, acquire influence within particular districts to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts, end quote. Disregarding government for some regional or geographical preference to suit our own interest is a sure way to erode our unity. Washington's view of our government was to show, quote, respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures, duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty, end quote. Washington believed that the Constitution and its authentic amending was an act by the people upon themselves, and that every American would naturally have an obligation to obey the established government for the experiment even to work. Quote, all obstructions to the execution of the laws, designs to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular constituted authorities are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternative triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-conceived and incongruous projects of a faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common counsels and modified by mutual interest, end quote. Washington foresaw that geographical interests could coalesce around party preferences, with urban and rural, coastal and inland, northern and southern, eastern and western, forming the basis by which we would try to empower ourselves with party faction to obtain the interest of one rather than the interest of all. For our government to work for the whole nation, he encouraged us to, quote, remember that time and habit are at least as necessary to fix the true character of governments as of other human institutions, end quote. For example, we understand that it takes time for a child to become an adult, or that an adult in time must master his or her skills and experience to succeed in work or creativity. Yet somehow we imagine that the difficult things of government can be solved in months, when in the natural flow of life, it takes years and decades to secure true accomplishment. Even if we were able to accept this wisdom, we find ourselves provoked to what Washington called, and I quote, the spirit of revenge, end quote, among parties as one faction would alternate domination over the other. Washington warned that it was, quote, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able and more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty, end quote. Washington warned that party faction would always distract public cooperation, weakening our government's ability to function. Loyalty to party over the nation would, in his phrases, agitate communities, kindle animosity, foment occasional riot and insurrection, and open the door for foreign influence and corruption to weaken the nation. He also warned of those using patriotism and liberty as their justification to stress the nation, rising in their deep conviction with a spirit of party and urgency, admitting that there would be some indulgence for this, if not favor. He warned that such a spirit was not to be encouraged. He called upon all Americans to not fan these embers as they were, quote, a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into flame, lest, instead of warming, it should consume, end quote. Warning number 3, the encroachment of national leaders. Washington warned that national leaders, quote, to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments into one, and thus create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. For this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed." End quote. Warning number 4, religious abandonment. For all of Washington's warnings about political and party faction, his remedy was very clear. So clear, in fact, that its absence, he said, would guarantee that our nation would lack human rights. And I quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for prosperity, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge in the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Who can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric?" End quote. Warning number 5, public debt and weakened defense. Washington had much to say about public debt. He believed it should be used as sparingly as possible, or public credit. He also believed one sure way to preserve the national treasury would be to promote peace, but also to fund the government on time. Proper funding would secure the nation, preventing greater costs to repel danger and burden the nation with debt. Toward all national debts, Washington reminded all Americans that it took revenue to pay them. And I quote, "The execution of these maxims belongs to your representatives, but it is necessary that public opinion should cooperate. To facilitate to them the performances of their duty, it is essential that you should practically bear in mind that towards the payment of debts there must be revenue, that to have revenue there must be taxes, that no taxes can be devised which are not more or less inconvenient and unpleasant." End quote. For these reasons, Washington warned that our motives must be decisive in the expense of government and to choose wisely the objects that we should fund. To ignore this would weaken our nation as a whole. Warning number 6, entangling and favored alliances. Washington's view of foreign policy was to, quote, "observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct, and can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened nation, and at no distant period, a great nation, to give mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence." End quote. Washington believed good morality would naturally create good foreign policy, fairness, and impartiality. He urged to treat all nations equally initially. He warned that adverse relations with nations would result in poor policy and unnecessary conflict. Unnecessary favor to particular nations might pull us into conflict with some other where we may have had no quarrel at all. Washington was passionate here, and I quote, "Against this insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. But that jealousy to be useful must be impartial." End quote. His final warning, partiality in commerce. Warning number 7. Washington instructed, and I quote, The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. Washington believes strong relations could be built upon commerce, keeping us in a fair and neutral position, preventing entanglement in disputes with other nations. He urged to steer clear of permanent alliances, but rather that we should, quote, safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies, end quote. Washington argued commerce should be equal and impartial, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors, to consult the natural course of things, to handle gently the natural streams of commerce, to force nothing, to define the rights of our merchants, to enter upon agreements in a temporary fashion, recognizing that from time to time such commerce could be abandoned or modified as needs and circumstances might dictate. Washington foresaw that if we expected disinterested favors from other nations without an equal benefit, there would be an accounting. He warned, and I quote, "There can be no greater error than to expect or calculate upon real favors from nation to nation," end quote. Now, George Washington had no illusions that his warnings would endure to control the nation's passions. He did hope, however, that they, quote, may be productive of some partial benefit, some occasional good, that they may now and then recur to moderate the fury of party spirit, to warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, to guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism, end quote. So where do we stand, Mr. Speaker, as a nation in these areas of warning? How are we doing on geographical and party disunion? We stand guilty of it. The average American citizen has only been to 8 of her 50 states, and our national leaders and our own people disrespect our nation's capital as a swamp. We see coastal cities referring to interior rural towns as flyover country, not realizing that nearly all of their food comes from it, while rural areas declaring coastal regions would not be missed if they simply fell into the ocean, not realizing that these areas represent the bulk of national trade and economy. We see Americans electing the most polarized to the left or to the right, sending them to work in Washington, D.C., wondering why they can't get along and get things done when they get here. We see elected leaders calling for disruption and resistance rather than discourse and result. We see chairs thrown through campus windows because we cannot abide free speech. We see history expunged because we cannot abide free thought. We have abandoned accommodation, bypassed toleration, encouraged isolation, organized intimidation, and are set to pursue a path to castigation. What is next? Elimination of our republic? We must get reacquainted as Americans with unity, with the idea that the nation comes before region, before party, before self. As a republic is a mutual enterprise, we must relearn how to keep it. And how are we doing on Washington's warning of national leaders encroaching on each other's branch of government or each other's business? We complain of judges legislating from benches while we judge from our legislatures. We see executive branches move by power of decree rather than by power of consent. We see people ignore federal authority while demanding federal aid. We have eroded respected institutions as elected leaders abandon civil conduct in hearings, confusing disruption, disrespect, and division somehow with democracy. We have deluded ourselves that rudeness is now a form of representation. If we cannot respect these hallowed institutions that we ourselves as Americans control, how can we possibly receive respect in return from our fellow citizens as we look to lead government. If we spent as much effort to watch our own lanes and make government business efficient rather than inflammatory, we might just restore some respect to the greatest constitutional republic that has ever existed. And Mr. Speaker, it starts with us. And how about Washington's warning on expecting morality without religion? We have traded accommodation for castigation, abandoning the very religious principles adorning all 13 of our original state constitutions, our own Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights. Every chamber, hall, ceiling, nook, and corner of our Capitol is adorned with these foundational beliefs. In this very chamber, In God We Trust, is over the Speaker's podium, and 97% of the members of Congress claim these principles in their personal beliefs. Why, then, have we become silent on the free exercise of religion guaranteed in the Constitution? We have imagined that we can show respect without being respectful. We have encouraged and exchanged truth for a lie, and now wonder why people are so uncivil to one another, and why we have faded hope, unclear vision, purpose, or reason to be a force for good in the world as a United States. Contrary to Washington's warnings, we imagine we can have morality without the free exercise of religion. We foolishly believe we can fix moral problems with political solutions. I am of the belief we need to ask God's forgiveness. And what of Washington's warning on public debt? 20 trillion and counting. We demand thrift from each other, but not from ourselves and our personal pocketbooks. The problem is so great today, but not greater than our people. If we lead by our individual examples, we, the nationally elected leaders, are a reflection of America as a whole. Until Americans demand fiscal discipline in themselves, it will be a long wait to expect it from those whom we elect. We, the people, have put ourselves in this situation by making demands of government to pay for all of our shortcomings. At some point, that payment becomes due. We must ask less from the government and more from ourselves, solving our problems locally, together, without an invitation for government control. And what of Washington's warning on alliances and trade? Rather than a fair and bilateral approach to nations, we have entangled ourselves in multinational permanent agreements on trade, without the vision to think that the circumstances may change. We have pledged long-term favored status by treaty as opposed to short-term agreements and objectives. We have a moral obligation to honor the agreements we've enjoined, but we would do well to heed Washington's counsel to approach foreign relations commercially and have as little political connection to them as possible. Mr. Speaker, George Washington's counsel is sorely needed today. We stand guilty in all 7 of his warnings. We are guilty but not irredeemable. Americans have a history of self-correction. Unfortunately, it often comes with some great distress or disaster. We can and must heed Washington's warnings now and correct by choice rather than by circumstance. As a combat infantryman, a warrior, returning home from more than 2 decades of personal service, who now has a political life, I have asked myself this question: how did we, as Americans, allow our voice to be co-opted by self-proclaimed cynics and critics on both sides of the political spectrum who have divided our great nation? When did American zeal for innovation, sweat, and determination become replaced with intimidation, threat, and extermination of meaningful dialogue by pathetic keyboard commandos eating their bags of cheese puffs while sunken into their couches. America has never been built on the labor and counsel of cynics and critics. Americans, we need to wake up. It's time to rekindle that spirit that united our country, ended enslavement, enriched our land, advanced our arts and sciences, granted women's suffrage, protested inequality, and protected the defenseless. Americans know the difference between what is evil and what is good. The question we must now ask is whether we will unite and continue to live free or continue to attack ourselves, give way to cynicism, and watch America's liberty and place in the world die. Thank God America is still full of men and women who know it is not the cynic and critic that dig the ditch, teach the child, inspire the solutions, or create the future. It is time for Americans to put America before self again, to inspire, to lead, to unify, and to sacrifice. It starts with each of us sacrificing a few things. Sacrifice doubt, sacrifice anxiety, sacrifice cynicism. America cannot allow warriors like me to come home from a decade of fighting and war to see our republic overcome by the self-indulgent, the divisive, and the visionless. And as visionary as we Americans and lovers of liberty claim to be, we will make little headway if our only answers to our friends and neighbors are mere sideline snipes about what is wrong with this country. Are we so short-sighted that we cannot accommodate dialogue, exchange ideas, show some deference and respect to one another, and rebuild our nation? It's time for the American people to embrace what is right about our wonderful country, not what's wrong with it. Let us heed Washington's warnings and get to work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back my time.
Excellent.